Thank you all for being here, and I want to especially thank Rafael for having invited me to this conference. I'm very much honored. The aim of my talk is to introduce the distinction between two types of principles underlying social institutions. Principles which pertain to the raison d'etre of social institutions, and on the other hand, principles which specify the conditions for the obtaining and functioning of institutional kinds. I will call the first type of principles essential principles, and the second type I will call definitional principles. And in order to introduce the distinction, I will pass through a story of leveling so as to make the distinction tangible. The idea will be that although the story of leveling that I will tell will be an abstract leveling, but the idea is that at an underlying level, we have essential principles which pertain to the point of institutions, to that in view of which we have the institution in abstraction from their instantiation in a particular institutionalized form. And at a more superficial level, we have definitional principles which pertain to the institutionalization of those kinds of institutional kinds and specify how institutional status is obtained. Then in the second part, I will spell out the difference between the two types of principles in terms of the notion of operativeness that I will characterize. But the suggestion will be that the truth of essential principles is independent of their operativeness, whereas the truth of definitional principles depends on their being operative in a certain context. And some terminological matters before I pursue. I take institutions in a broad sense that is used in the literature on constitutive rules, especially. And I take institutions as complexes of positions, roles, and norms which serve some function or purport to some value. An institution, the term institution refers to stable social arrangements created and maintained to serve the needs of society. And in a Searlean spirit, I will take the distinctive feature of institutional kinds as the following. An understanding of institutional statuses requires that we make a symbolic move, so to speak. That is, it requires that we take an entity as having a certain deontic profile in virtue of the fact that it has that institutional status. And in this broad sense of institutions that I will use in this talk, games, marriage, money, government, and promising are all institutional entities. And second, the definitional and essential principles that I said I want to introduce. These terms, definitional and essential, I will take from Searle and Williamson respectively in debates on constitutive rules of speech acts, although I will not introduce the two types of principles in terms of constitutive rules. But because initially I was interested in constitutive rules, these terms came from that debate. Now, my suggestion, in short, is that social institutions involve both definitional principles and essential principles. Definitional principles pertain to the instantiation of institutional kinds. They determine the conditions for the obtaining and functioning of institutional kinds. And essential principles pertain to the relation between institutions, such as competitive games and marriage, that I will take as examples, and the underlying values and functions in view of which those institutions emerge. In order to make the distinction tangible, I will start by making 3 sets of examples. One pair of examples from games. A principle such as checkmate is a position in which the king is under attack and there is no possible move to escape. This is what I call a definitional principle because it articulates the instantiation conditions for the position of checkmate in chess. But the principle that in competitive games, we aim at attaining the winning position, this is what I call an essential principle. Because this principle pertains to one goal of the practice of competitive games, that in view of which we engage in the practice. Winning in the context of playing competitive games is a value in that context, which gives significance to this social practice. Now, to take the example of money, a principle such as that a certain kind of greening paper issued by the Bureau of Engraving and Printing is $1. This is a definitional principle because it's part of the conditions through the satisfaction of which the status of dollar will get assigned on a certain piece of green ink paper. But on the other hand, the fact that money is a means of exchange, I call this an essential principle underlying the institution of money, because it pertains to the raison d'etre of money in human societies, that in view of which we have its function. And now to take the example of promising that I take as well as an institutional kind. The fact that promising generates obligation, or in Serlian terminology, that promising counts as undertaking an obligation, this is again an essential principle because it pertains to the point of the practice of promising, that in view of which this practice is enforced in human societies. In order to introduce now the distinction between definitional and essential principles in general terms, for making it tangible, I will tell this story of leveling, and I will lay the stones of the distinction in terms of a story of leveling, and my focus will be rather on practices, but the analysis, the distinction, and the story can be extended to other institutional kinds as well. So the suggestion will be that definitional principles and essential principles pertain to two different levels in their relation to social institutions, and that we can extend this leveling, say, to other social institutions. Now, to present the story of leveling, take castling in chess. Castling is not a self-standing practice. It is a sub-practice. It's a move defined inside the practice of chess. It takes its significance from within the context of playing chess. It's dependent for being meaningful on the practice of chess. But chess as a whole social practice, it's a self-standing practice. It's not a component of competitive games. It's one species of competitive games, one way of engaging in the practice of competitive games. Analogously, French marriage is a self-standing practice. It's not a component of marriage. It is one species of marriage. And now best man and honeymoon, as analogous to castling and checkmate, these are technical notions defined within the institution of Anglo-spheric marriages, and they take their significance from within the context of those special forms of marriages. I will not focus on this. So this is the three levels that I'm distinguishing. So I will not focus on this level, the level of technical notions defined within institutions. I will rather be focused on these two levels. The idea is that competitive games cannot be performed tout court, as well as marriage. Marriage cannot be performed tout court. When we are in this underlying level, the practice cannot be realized as such. In order for competitive games and marriage to be instantiable, we need to pass through a specific procedure which would determine the way to go for the performance of these practices. And here, my suggestion is that here in this level, in this underlying level, we have only essential principles. And when we determine the procedure to go for the instantiation of these practices in this underlying level, we will pass through what I call definitional principles. So the principles underlying marrying and competitive games, independent of the specific forms that these practices take, are what I call essential principles. When these practices are institutionalized in one form or another, we pass through what I call definitional principles, which specify the form of the practice and its functioning. They determine how the practice is to be instantiated in a particular form against the background of its essential rules. Thus, institutional practices come with two types of principles. At an underlying level, we have essential principles which pertain to these practices in their brute or naked state, in abstraction from their getting instantiated in a particular form that is structurally prior to their getting institutionalized. And at a more superficial level, we have definitional principles which pertain to the institutionalization of those practices, which give shape to those practices and specify their obtention condition and functioning. The underlying idea is that social practices such as competitive games and marriage have come to existence in societies only in view of some needs and functions and values. There is some point to them which reveals their place in the heart of human societies. And this is why all these practices are underlain by what I call essential principles, which pertain to the relation between social institutions and the underlying values or aims in view of which those practices then in turn take different forms relative to different institutional contexts. Now, to complete the picture, I want to claim that a practice like promising as well as asserting, these are social practices which can come to be realized to core. That is, in order to instantiate these practices, we do not need to pass through through a specific formatting relative to a specific institutional context. And I will explain more about this in what follows. The idea is that while practices such as competitive games, marriage, governing, etc., cannot be performed outside a specific institutionalized procedure, an act such as promising, as we know it in colloquial use, remains a social practice for the instantiation of which we do not need to pass through a specific institutionalization in a specific context. And I'm using promising and asserting not as illocutionary acts here. I'm taking them as kinds of social practices. The promising is a social practice, a kind of social practice. Of course, promising needs some outward expression for its instantiation through mutually recognized signs or conventional language. But this concretization of the practice, this instantiation of the practice in the form of understandable signs, does not mean institutionalization of the practice itself. It's just a way of expressing the one and a single practice of promising. Indeed, in order to promise, we should express the promissory intention, but the answer to the two questions, how do we promise and what normative consequences follow from the act of promising, can be given without reference to a specific way through which we bring about an instance of promising. Whereas in the case of marriage or games, an answer to these two questions cannot be given independently of a particular institutional context in which the how and the what then of the practice have been determined. In fact, I want to call practices such as competitive games and marriage as essentially conventional practices. They are such, essentially conventional practices are such that there needs to be, it's part of what they are, that there needs to be a specific man-made procedure for their instantiability, a set of principles, the satisfaction of which we would count as, to take certain formula, the realization of that particular state. So each set of these principles, each set of these definitional principles, the satisfaction of which would count as engaging in essentially conventional practices, each set of these principles would give rise to a species of these practices. For example, rock, paper, scissors is a conventional species of the practice of competitive games. Other species are chess and football, rugby. Of course, chess, football, rugby, and different forms of marriages are highly codified, and it's not appropriate to talk about them in terms of being conventional. But the idea is that each of them is constituted, each of these specific instantiations is constituted by a specific set of definitional principles which have an arbitrariness anyway with respect to the functions that they incorporate. Now, by contrast, a practice such as promising, commanding, and asserting, these practices are not essentially conventional. And although there are, of course, different conventional ways to instantiate them, these are just forms of ways of expressing the same practice. These different conventional ways of expressing promising by passing through utterance of I promise or by making a pinky swearing, all these conventional forms do not constitute different species of the practice of promising. So let's take, to make this more tangible, take two contemporary people, A and B, from different cultures and languages who fall in love during an excursion on an island and decide to get married. For these two people cannot just get married. In order for A and B to get married, there needs to be a way to instantiate that practice. There need to be a way for them to get married, a set of principles which would determining what consists the act of getting married, what is the procedure to get married, and what are the consequences of having that status of being married. Of course, and A and B should get married in conformity with some system, whether Islamic system, newer marriage, French marriage, but they should conform to a set of principles which will constitute a specific species of the act of the institution of marriage, and which would determine in what consists getting married. Of course, marriage is a very complex example, with not only with many forms, but with many types of forms. But the point I'm making here is general, so it applies as well to the practice of games. So take two people, A and B, who are bored on a beach, and they decide to get to play a game. They cannot just play a game. There need to be a set of rules, so to speak, which would specify in what consists the game that they want to play. And this was the sense in which I said that the practices like competitive games and marriage cannot be realized tout court. They are not realizable by themselves as such. In order to make them instantiable, for them to be realizable, we pass through definitional principles. By contrast, take A and B who want to and take A, who wants to make a promise to B. In whatever way A proceeds to communicate her promissory intention to B, once the communication is successful, A has thereby undertaken an obligation in virtue of the very fact that he has made a promise to B. Indeed, the obligation which arises by virtue of the instantiation of the practice of promising is regardless of the conditions for the practice of promising to get instantiated. This is, of course, because promising is a communicative act, but I want to suggest that as a kind of act, as a kind of social practice, promising belongs to the realm of institutional practices, although it is not essentially conventional, and although it's not constituted by conventions as a kind of practice. So now I want to explain more, but I want to explain in what sense, to explain more about in what sense I take promising to belong to the realm of institutional practices. I introduced this notion of essentially social acts or practices, and I characterize essentially social acts or practices as acts or practices which require some joint attitudes for their very possibility as kinds. And if we take this characterization of essentially social acts as requiring joint attitudes for their very possibility, then the paradigmatic example of essentially social acts are joint actions with joint goals. But what I want to suggest is that communicative speech acts can as well be said to be essentially social insofar as they need for their very possibility as kinds that they be addressed to another person so as to make themselves known to her. This conception of communicative acts as being essentially social, as requiring that they be addressed to another person so as to make themselves known to her, has been proposed by Thomas Reid and Adolf Reinach, and both of them take it that while an act like concluding is not essentially social because it does not require the being addressed for its possibility, acts like promising, commands, requests, warnings, and thankings are all of them essentially social acts because they need to be addressed. They need some joint attitude, even if only in the sense of joint attitude to the communicative content. But all of them need to be addressed to another person, and all of them are thus essentially social acts. Now, my suggestion was that while promising and commands are institutional, can be said to be institutional acts in the broad sense, requests, warning, and thanking do not belong to the realm of institutional activities. And in order to put this notion, in general, we can say that all essentially social acts involve individual roles, but in the case of institutional acts, in the broad sense that I was using, the rules are such that in order to grasp in what consists that institutional role, we need to be able to represent the bearer of the role as having a deontic status in virtue of the very fact that she bears that institutional role. And this notion, this again has a Searle Spice, the notion of deontic status that Searle talks about it in terms of conventional powers or deontic powers. So to make an example, to make this notion of roles tangible, suppose that John and Mary want to decide to perform the joint action of washing the dishes together. And John takes the role of scrubber, so to speak, and Mary takes the role of rinser. For Mary to play the role of rinser is for her to remove soap and detergent from dishes with water. And attributing the role of rinser to Mary in this joint action does not require that we could represent her as having an obligation or right in virtue of her very status as a rinser. So being a rinser is a role in an essentially social activity, but it has nothing institutional to it. When compare this to if now we inscribe this joint action of John and Mary in a competition. Suppose that there is this game competition where groups of 2 people compete with each other for the fastest dishwashing. Here, the role of Mary, the role of Mary to rinse, it does not boil down to removing soaps and detergents from dishes with water. Here, it involves having the role of rinser in this competition involves being subject to a certain set of rules and procedures, for example, having been admitted to participate in the competition, proceeding to rinse the dishes with a certain amount or pressure of water, and in a previously determined and limited amount of time. So in both versions of this example, Mary has the role of rinser, but in the first version, the role of rinser is not an institutional role, because in order to understand in what it consists, rinsing, we do not need to represent her as having, we do not need to represent deontic notions. But in the second version, where she is rinsing within the context of the competition, the role of rinser involves to understand in what consists her role, we need to represent deontic notions. So by the same token, if we apply this to the case of communicative acts, thanking, warning, and requesting are not institutional, because thanking, for example, is the act of expressing one's attitude or one's gratitude, appreciation, such that in order to understand the act of thanking, we do not need to represent any deontic notion. By contrast, promising belongs to the realm of institutional activities, because in order to understand in what consists promising, we need to understand that the performing subject has a new deontic profile in virtue of her very status as a promising. In order to understand promising, we need to be able to represent deontic notions. And this is why promising belongs to the realm of institutional activities. To be sure, as I said, there are many different ways to instantiate the act of promising, different conventional ways to express promising. And for example, uttering "I promise" in a certain circumstance counts as making a promise if we take the Countess formula. Or making a pinky swear, it counts as making a promise. Both of these are conventional ways of bringing about an instance of promising. And both of these can be said to be definitional principles, which specify the conditions for the instantiation of the practice of promising. But these different conventional ways of bringing about an instance of promising, as I said, don't give rise to different species of the same practice. They are merely different ways to express the one and the same practice, which, as a matter of necessity, creates an obligation for the performing subject, in the sense that everything which is a promise generates an obligation and cannot fail to generate an obligation. The essential principle of promising, according to which promising generates an obligation, is not a matter of convention. It's a matter of necessity. So with this characterization of definitional and essential principles, it seems that definitional principles are similar to the orthodox characterization of constitutive rules in the literature, insofar as they lay down conditions for institutional status to obtain in a certain context. By contrast, is an essential principle. Essential principles are far removed from being constitutive rules or something similar. They seemingly merely make explicit what is implicit already in the underlying structure of the institutional practices. And this is how I want to spell out the difference between definitional and essential principles precisely. I want to suggest that while definitional principles are true only with respect to a certain institutional context, essential principles are true as a matter of necessity. And I will try to spell out this difference in terms of the notion of operativeness. In terms of the notion of operative. I take operativeness or being in force or efficacious as similar. In debates on legal theory, we use the notion of efficacy or being in force paradigmatically for rules and legal norms. And even in legal theory, it's very difficult to spell out in what consists the efficacy, but very, very roughly the idea is that just as statements are true or false, rules and norms are efficacious or not. To be sure, definitional principles are not rules in the strict sense, although they may get codified and become legal norms. And essential principles are even farther removed from being rules and norms. So instead of talking about efficacy, I use the term operativeness to remove the connotations of the debates in legal jargon about efficacy of legal norms and rules. The idea is that by saying that the principle is operative, what I mean is that it's a principle which in fact governs an institutional practice. Why can't the principles I'm talking about are principles which underlie social institutions? Why can we can still use the term operativeness when we're talking about these principles? Because it's legitimate to ask about principles that in fact govern institutional practices at different times and in different contexts. We can ask, for example, whether for Oneness Pentecostals, the use of the Trinitarian formula is among the set of principles determining the conditions for the act of baptism to be carried out, or whether expression of consent by both parties had been among the set of principles determining the conditions for getting married in France in the 12th century. So we can well use the notion of operativeness for principles underlying institutions. But on the other hand, and parallelly, there is a sense in which we can well ask about the truth and falsity of these principles. We can say that it's true that in trine baptism, having used the Trinitarian formula, one baptizes in water rather than in milk, or that during the celebration of French marriage, as we know it in its contemporary forms, each to-be spouse gives his or her consent to the act of marriage. We can also say that it's true that promising to do A results in an obligation on the side of the promiser to do A. Now, it might seem that when with regard to principles underlying institutional practices, we can say that they are just they are true just in case they are operative. And what I want to suggest now is that although this claim may be made with respect to definitional principles, we cannot make the same claim with regard to essential principles. In other words, I want to suggest that while the truth of definitional principles is dependent on their operativeness in a certain context, the truth of essential principles is independent of their operativeness. And in parentheses, note that I will focus on the very state of being operative without analyzing what it takes for a principle to get to be operative or to be operative. That is, my question is not about that in virtue of which a principle becomes operative, nor about necessary and sufficient conditions for a principle to be operative. I will rather limit myself to the very state of operativeness when a principle has binding force, to take a legal jargon. This just the very state of being operative. And now to look at the case of definitional principles, although my focus was on practices, I will take here the example of money because it's much used in the literature and I want to make a comment about it with regard to the specific case of money. So take and suppose that this simplified version, this simplified principle is a definitional principle for US dollars. Screening paper issued by the BEP count as or are US dollars. But the suggestion is that whether or not screening papers issued by the BEP are US dollar depends on whether or not there is an operative principle in the US to the effect that this is so, with respect to which we evaluate the truth of this definitional principle. This definitional principle is one which is at present actually operative in the US, and it is therefore true that greening papers issued by the BEP are dollar bills. Before the Federal Reserve Act of 1913 was signed into the American law, old national bank notes were used as dollar bills, and it was thus not true that greening papers issued by the BEP are dollar bills. And now, if the operative principle changes again, such that Federal Reserve notes get replaced by the old national bank notes, then it will not be true anymore that dollar bills are issued by the BEP. To take another example from baptism, the truth of the principle that the procedure of baptism involves full immersion in water depends on whether this principle is among those governing the practice of Christian baptism. It is, for instance, operative in Oneness Pentecostalism, but not in Presbyterianism. The general suggestion is that the truth of definitional principles is dependent on their being operative in some institutional context in which the instantiation conditions for institutional statuses are specified and with respect to which we evaluate its truth. I want to make the claim more precise. Definitional principles are true in virtue of their operativeness. They are true because they are operative. And this is the sense of dependence between truth and operativeness in the case of definitional principles. Now, to see what happens with essential principles, the principle that promising to do A generates an obligation to do A is true independent of any institutional context. That in France, a promise can be made by uttering je promets in appropriate circumstances, and in Japan by ubiquity or by whatever other conventional means, has no bearing on the truth of this principle. This essential principle underlies each instance of promising, and its truth is independent of the performance conditions of the act of promising. It is true that promising to do A generates an obligation on the side of the promiser to do A, whether we are in France or in Japan or in the Tonga Islands of the South Pacific, where people are said not to have the practice of promising at all. To take two other examples, that marriage is a culturally or legally recognized union in personal relationship which generates rights and obligations, can be thought as an essential principle of the institution of marriage. It is true irrespective of the cultural or legal context at play in which the operative definitional principles are specified, pertaining to the instantiation conditions and the rights and obligations incurred. And to take an example of competitive games, the fact that the aim is to attain a certain position by acting in accordance with a certain set of rules is essential to the practice as a kind, irrespective of the specific set of rules which in turn give rise to various competitive games and determine the procedure to attain the winning position. So to just finish up, the suggestion is that definitional principles are true in virtue of being operative in a certain context with respect to which we evaluate their truth. Essential principles are true irrespective and independent of their operativeness. Although it is in virtue of the fact that def dollar is operative in US that greening papers issued by the BEP are dollar bills, it is not in virtue of the fact that the essential principle of promising is operative in some context that promising in fact generates obligation. Obligation is part of the intrinsic structure of a promise. I want to finish by two concluding remarks, and if I don't have time, I will skip the second one. And as a conclusion, Searle famously said that institutional facts are all intentionality relative, and to characterize intentionality relative phenomena as those which depend for their very existence on being thought about, attended to, regarded as, or treated as in a certain way by human agents. They are ontologically dependent on human agents or human intentionality. And he famously claimed that money, because it's an institutional kind, is intentionality relative in the sense that money is money because we think of it as money. And this sentence has been subject to many criticisms. And in particular, one angle from which we can attack this sentence is the because part. Searle's own reading of this sentence is that a certain type of money, a certain type of entity is a means of exchange because we regard it as a means of exchange. So a certain type of entity performs the functions of money because we regard it as performing those functions. And one of the angles I said which focus on the because part is that it's not because we regard it as money that a certain type of entity is indeed money. Most objections to Searle's idea of the attitude dependence of money pertain to this aspect. They claim that in the complex legal story which should be told about what underlies the fact that some type of object is money, our attitudes do not play a constitutive part. I think that whether or not a certain type of entity is a means of exchange because we regard it as a means of exchange is tantamount to whether or not the definitional principle, the dollar, is operative in virtue of our regarding it as operative. This is how I translate this sentence. And I said in parentheses that, as you see, this refers to the question of that in virtue of which principles are operative. And I tried to, in this talk, I tried to let this question aside, the question of that in view of which principles are operative. And I formulated the difference between the two principles, definitional and essential principles, by appeal to the very state of operativeness and without endorsing any particular theory of that in virtue of which principles are or come to be operative. In fact, all along, I used the notion of operativeness precisely to separate the state of operativeness from that in virtue of which principles are or get to be operative. The operativeness amounts to the notion of being in place, which then in turn raises the separate question of that in virtue of which the principle is put in place or is in place. And this latter question is what Epstein calls the question of anchoring. Now, abstraction from this separate question of that in virtue of which principles are or come to be operative, the difference between definitional and essential principles can be spelled out through two readings of the Searlean sentence with respect to different interpretations of this first word, of this first occurrence of the word money. The first is that a certain type of paper is a means of exchange because we think of it as a means of exchange, and this is Searle's own reading. And the second is money as a kind is a means of exchange because we think of it as a means of exchange. And in fact, my distinction between definitional and essential principles was situated here. That a certain type of paper is a means of exchange, this is what I call definitional principles, and that money as a kind is a means of exchange was an essential principle. So although I put aside the question of that in virtue of which principles are operative, but although this reading that a certain type of paper is a means of exchange because we think of it as a means of exchange is in turn subject to the objection that I just mentioned about the anchoring question, and to which it may or may not resist the objection that it's not because we think of it as a means of exchange that a certain type of paper is a means of exchange. Although this reading of this definitional principle is subject to that objection about the anchoring question, this second reading is outright false, irrespective of the theory of anchoring we want to opt for. In fact, I tentatively attempted to distinguish between the two principles by suggesting that while the truth of def dollar is dependent on its being operative in a certain context, the truth of the essential principle that money as a kind is a means of exchange is independent of its operativeness in a certain context, and a fortiori, it's independent of any human attitudes, decisions, and actions. This fact about money is intentionality independent. Essential principles articulate intentionality independent facts about human institutions. They hold regardless of our attitudes, decisions, or actions, and this is why they are essential principles. I have a second concluding remark, but I think I have finished with 40 minutes, so maybe I can just take 1 minute to pass through this. The second remark is that, the second concluding remark, although I don't want to push that far, is that I think we may account for the role of operativeness of definitional principles in Epstein's framework through the notion of frames in his account. For Epstein, frame principles, what I call definitional principles, merely articulate the grounding conditions for social facts. They are merely part of the picture frame. And the frame is a set of possible worlds in which the grounding conditions for social facts are fixed in a particular way. In this framework, the grounding conditions for institutional and social facts are fixed across the entire frame. The conditions for institutional facts to obtain are fixed across the entire set of possible worlds within the frame, even in those worlds where we do not exist. So Epstein's framework is a very complex one. He has this notion of frame, which consists in a set of possible worlds in which we fix a frame principle, and then we can have multiple frames which are multiple sets of multiple universes of possible words for each of which we have a fixed frame principle or definitional principle. But it seems to me that the role that the operativeness of definitional principles plays in what I suggested would amount to what we may translate in this framework as the specification of a frame within which a definitional principle is then fixed. I said that all green ink papers issued by the BEP are dollar bills is dependent on the fact that this dollar is operative. In Epstein's frameworks, it will be that all green ink papers issued by the BEP are dollar bills is dependent on the fact that we are in the frame, a certain frame, for example, the frame of US Federal Reserve Act. So although Epstein's framework is very complex and I didn't want to make a correspondence with his theory, I still think that although Epstein conceives of the possibility of fixing, conceives of multiple frames, and he fixes the definitional principles within a certain frame, which consists of different possible words. And so he can conceive of a certain definitional principles to apply to many, to a certain set of possible words. Still, that the truth of definitional principles depends on their being operative in a certain context would amount to the suggestion that definitional principles are frame dependent. I mean that even in the abstraction from the complexity of Epstein's framework, we can still distinguish between definitional and essential principles by saying that while definitional principles are frame dependent, essential principles are not. While definitional principles are necessary only within a frame, so to speak, essential principles are necessary to core. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maryam. Maybe you could share your thoughts if we see any other. Okay. So thank you for your very interesting and very rich talk. So I don't know if there are questions. Thomas, you have a question?
Hi there. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Yeah. Sorry for picking out a very small thing in the talk, but it just intrigued me. So you had this remark about the role division between the scrubber and the rinser and you said that that was a case in which there's no deontic notions involved, I think, if I recall correctly. So there's no rights or obligations there. So I wasn't entirely sure about the construal of that case. So one thing is, so I take it that to be the rinser in this situation, it doesn't suffice to just be engaged in the activity of rinsing. It must be that there's some kind of division of labor in place where someone is doing this and your assigned part of that division of labor is the rinsing, and that would make you have that role. Now, you might be tempted at that point to say, oh, well, there is some deontic notion involved for if you have an assigned part in a division of labor, then there's something that you're obliged to do insofar as you're engaged in that joint activity at all, namely the rinsing. Now, I'm not sure if that's right, but you might think that even if that's not right, that there's still a sort of another sense of normativity that does come into play here, which is not so much a deontic, but more of an evaluative kind of normativity. So if I am the rinser in the division of labor, then there is something which is my part to play, and I can then be judged as being sort of living up or failing to live up to that part of the division of labor, and that does seem to be kind of normativity, which might fall short of me being under an actual obligation to keep rinsing. So I was just curious whether you just be happy to go along with that, or whether so that it's specifically the deontic stuff which makes the big difference for you, but other kinds of normativity could happily be involved without sort of blurring the kind of lines that you want to draw, or yeah, well, basically how you would be tempted to construe this case.
Yes, I agree that there is normativity. Even we may say that there is obligation to live up the role, but these are not institutional outs or it's not an institutional normativity. It's say moral, or it's due to the joint commitment, in the sense that in order it comes out of it does not come out of Mary's status as rinser. It comes out of Mary's status as participant in that joint activity. So because she is, I mean, this normativity governs all essentially social activities as qua social activities, not qua an institutional status. When I talk about deontic powers, which come out of institutional statuses, the deontic notion is applied to the performing subject in virtue of the very status, not in virtue of a more general, the very fact of human interaction, which in turn involves a normativity, normativity of jointness. You see what I mean? That when we have promising, the fact that the performing subject has an obligation, this obligation comes out of the very status of the promiser. Not as my having a role of a participant in a joint activity, but those kinds of normative notions that you were talking about, I think they belong to the very fact of human social interaction. They are, say, moral.
Okay. No, thanks. I'm not sure I'd go along with that, but thanks. Yeah, that is helpful.
In order to understand in order to understand in what consists rinsing, we do not need to understand that Mary in itself has by the very act of rinsing has a certain deontic profile. Right,
but there is a difference here between the act of rinsing and the role of being a rinser, right? So there could be more packed into the latter than is involved in just understanding what rinsing is.
Yes, so when we have institutional statuses, it's because it comes from the very act itself. It's from the very act of promising that the deontic notion is involved. In the act of rinsing, we do not have it, so it's not institutional. In the role of rinser, we have it, but what we have in the role of rinser is not on the same par with the institutional acts. It's just in virtue of her participating in a social interaction, not in virtue of the very status. It's not specific to rinsing. If she was performing whatever other role in that social in that joint action, she would again have all these normative aspects to live up to her role, to not to be careful.
The further questions, so I don't know if we have time for all, but there is the next is Muhammad Ali, I think.
Thanks. Maybe this relates to Thomas's question. I guess I was I had a question about the contrast that you seem to be drawing between sort of more institutionalized social practices and ones that are not as institutionalized. And so you were drawing this contrast between competitive games and marriage and governing, which you said can't be performed outside a specific institutionalized procedure. You know, two people on a beach can't just play a game. But it seems to me that that's often what happens. I mean, we do start to, it helps to understand how these institutions actually emerge, to think of the ways in which they gradually become institutionalized. So we might just be kicking a ball back and forth on the sand, and then we start keeping points, and we find, oh, there's certain rules that are emerging here. You can't touch it twice or something like that. Otherwise, you lose a point. And same with governing, you know, someone emerges within a group as being a kind of an informal leader, and then people start to hold them accountable in certain ways and so on. So I'm not sure that the contrast with promising is as stark as you seem to be making it out to be. So yeah, sorry, maybe I'll stop there.
Yeah. Yes, maybe I used the word institutionalizing, so maybe it was misleading, because the point I was making is not that they need to be codified necessarily. The example of the beach was that A and B cannot just play a game. They have to be something in which it consists, and they may invent a game on the spot, or there may be just kicking the ball on the sand, etc. But all these are, I just wanted to say that there need to be a way for it cannot be realized as such. There need to be a set of, I don't know, principles which may not be codified, or they may just be invented or by convention, or may just have evolved, or may have been enacted, etc. But this actually does not pertain, this point I'm making, it does not pertain to the institutionality aspect. It pertains to the conventionality aspect. The games and marriage are kinds of practices which need to have some arbitrary instantiations. This arbitrary instantiation in a paradigmatic case can be through a convention, but it can be through an enactment. The point I was making was just that they should be instantiated in a specific form. But once we have the concept of promising, and here the question is not about institutionality, it's about conventionality. Once we have the concept of promising, you can just mind read, and the act is performed.
Brian, you had a question?
Yes. So I thought this was fascinating and very challenging topic. You know, I agree with a lot of your characterization of the issues. One of the things that I'm a little bit, I've grappled with and that I find very challenging about this is kind of, you know, you talk sort of about the raison d'etre of some of these institutions and talk about the functional roles. And it's not altogether clear when the functional role should be regarded as essential to the kind itself, like to the local, you know, the in-frame kind or the realization of the kind, or rather essential to a different kind. So, I mean, like, suppose that the function of marriage, for instance, is to, you know, stabilize kinship relations in a culture, or to generate power relations, or, you know, whatever the function is. Again, it's not altogether clear whether that ought to be understood as causally related to the kind that we have in our society, or whether it is genuinely essential to it. Maybe there's a different functional kind, which is, or there's a different kind, which is a functional kind, that is the kind of stabilizing kinship relations in a culture. And there's a relation between marriage, you know, say French marriage, and that functional kind. But that doesn't make the function essential to the kind itself. And I think that the same kind of question might be asked with money. You know, so you might say, well, look, you know, there's something about the functional role of money, like, you know, providing a medium of exchange, that where the money kind is a realizer of a role kind, say, but the role kind is not, the role is not part of what it is to be, you know, what the realizer kind is. I guess that what I'm wondering is, you know, it's that I think it's that your claim is that there is something kind of inextricable about the kind of, you know, general functional role that the realizer kinds plays in terms of kind of characterizing those as essential to those realizer kinds. But I'm not clear why that should be the relation of the functional role to the kind itself. As opposed to say a causal explanation of why we have that kind.
So you're saying that the function because the function may vary, or just in general you think that the function should not be construed as what the thing is? Is it the second? That was your question?
Yeah, it's more the second. Yeah.
But I don't. When I talk about essential principles, these are aspects. My question is the relation which holds between that value and this specific value and the kind itself. So I'm not exhausting what an institutional kind is to say that it is just this. I'm just saying that this relation, the fact that it's a means of exchange, it is an essential aspect of, just in the sense of necessity. I'm not trying to exhaust a definition of institutional kinds by their essential aspects. We can say this is why we can say that competitive games are kinds of acts in which we aim to attain a certain position by passing through a set of rules. This passing through a set of rules is not the function, it's the means of, it's the function, but it's part of what is essential to the practice of competitive games. Or that about marriage, I didn't use any specific function because marriage has different types of forms. And I think these functions are specific to those institutionalized forms, and they're not essential to marriage. Even living together or being loyal, none of these are essential. None of these are essential to the kind of marriage, to marriage as a kind. What is essential is that there be a union, otherwise it has no sense, and a union which gives rights to certain rights and obligations for the two parties which get bound in this union. But this is not really a definition of marriage. It's very large, and it can, in different contexts, it can be applied to a lover's relationship. In one context may be considered as a marriage relationship in another culture. I mean, so I did not try to define marriage. I was just saying that being a union with us, the rights and obligations is essential. It's an essential aspect of the practice of marriage.
Okay, thank you.
So thank you,